At first, it sounded impossible. 4 destroyers, light, fast, outgunned, turning toward a heavy cruiser that had survived years of war. No air cover, no battleships, no second chance. This was not supposed to be a fight. It was supposed to be a cleanup. Instead, it became the last naval gunfight of World War II. Night fell quietly over the waters off the Malacca Strait in May 1945. The sea was calm, almost indifferent, as if unaware that it was about to witness the end of an era. Somewhere in the darkness, the Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro moved south at a cautious speed, her engines throttled back, her crew exhausted, hungry, and painfully aware of how alone they were. Haguro had once been part of a proud fleet. She had fought at Java Sea, survived the chaos of Guadalcanal, and carried the weight of a navy that had dominated the Pacific only 3 years earlier. Now she sailed with a single destroyer escort, tasked with a mission that already felt desperate, running supplies through waters controlled almost entirely by the enemy. Inside her steel hull, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The crew went through routines by muscle memory alone. Ammunition checks, engine reports, lookouts straining their eyes into blackness so complete it felt solid. No one spoke about air attacks anymore. By 1945, Japanese sailors had learned that silence from the sky did not mean safety. It only meant uncertainty. What they did not know was that 4 British destroyers had been waiting for nights like this. These ships were smaller, faster, and designed for aggression in close quarters. Their crews were experienced, methodical, and calm in a way that only comes from knowing the war is almost over and still being willing to die before it ends. They had been tracking Japanese movements through intercepted signals, narrowing down possibilities, predicting routes, waiting for a single ship to make a fatal mistake. Shortly before midnight, radar screens aboard the destroyers flickered with a contact, then another, then confirmation. A lone cruiser, moving slowly, no air support. Orders were brief. There was no dramatic speech, no celebration, just quiet acknowledgement. This was what destroyers were built for. Not glory, not survival, precision. As the British formation spread out, engines humming just above idle, the distance closed mile by mile. On Haguro, the first hint of danger came not from radar, but from instinct. A lookout hesitated, then reported a shape where there should have been none. Officers leaned in. Bearings were taken again. The sea, moments earlier empty, now felt crowded. Searchlights snapped on, too late. In the next few minutes, the war at sea would return to something ancient and brutal. No aircraft, no missiles, just steel, fire, and men firing guns across dark water at point-blank range. The kind of battle admirals no longer planned for, the kind history was about to forget. And when the first shells were fired, it would mark the last time in World War II that warships met each other like this, face to face, gun to gun, with nowhere to hide. The first shells did not arrive all at once. They arrived as questions. White splashes erupted off Haguro's bow, close enough that the shock slapped against her hull. A second later, another burst struck the water off her port side. The spacing was wrong for random fire. This was deliberate, ranging shots. On the bridge, officers shouted bearings. Orders snapped through speaking tubes. The cruiser heeled slightly as her rudder shifted, engines pushing harder, trying to turn a long, vulnerable hull away from danger that could not yet be fully seen. Then the night exploded. British destroyers opened fire almost simultaneously, their guns flashing in rapid, disciplined sequences. The darkness shattered into fragments of orange flame and drifting smoke. Tracers stitched glowing lines across the water, arcing low and fast, disappearing into steel. Haguro answered at once. Her main guns swung toward muzzle flashes barely visible through smoke and spray. When she fired, the recoil ran through the ship like a physical blow. The sound was not a crack, but a deep, tearing concussion, as if the air itself were being ripped apart. For a moment, the imbalance of the fight seemed obvious. A heavy cruiser still carried guns that could tear a destroyer in half with a single hit. One solid salvo could end this entire engagement. But destroyers were not here to trade evenly. They closed the distance. British ships split, attacking from multiple angles, forcing Haguro to swing her guns back and forth, never able to settle, never able to focus. Each turn exposed more of her length. Each correction bought the attackers seconds. Shells began to find steel. A hit smashed into Haguro's upper works, spraying fragments across the deck. Another tore through secondary gun mounts, killing crews before they could react. Alarms rang. Damage control teams ran towards smoke so thick it burned the lungs. On the British ships, crews worked with cold efficiency. Guns fired, reloaded, fired again. Orders were shouted once, then followed without hesitation. There was no celebration, no shouting, only the steady rhythm of men who knew exactly what they were doing. Then came the torpedoes. In the black water, unseen and unstoppable, they raced toward the cruiser's hull. Haguro turned hard, her engines straining, screws churning white foam. One torpedo passed close enough that its wake scraped along her side like a warning. Another did not miss. The explosion struck below the waterline with a force that lifted the ship and slammed her back down. Lights flickered. Men were thrown against bulkheads. In the engine spaces, gauges shattered and steam burst from ruptured pipes. The cruiser slowed. That single moment changed everything. Now the destroyers pressed in closer, almost reckless in their aggression. At this range, gunfire became brutally accurate. Shells punched into Haguro's superstructure, ripping open command spaces, shredding communication lines. Fires multiplied faster than they could be contained. Still, Haguro fought. Her gunners, many of them wounded, kept firing through smoke and flame. One British destroyer took a near miss that showered her deck with shrapnel. Another was rocked by a shell that struck close enough to buckle plates and kill exposed crew. But the tide could not be reversed. With steering damaged and speed dropping, Haguro became a target instead of a threat. Torpedoes came again, launched from different angles, forcing desperate turns that only worsened flooding. Compartments sealed, pumps failed. The list began, slow at first, then undeniable. Inside the cruiser, the reality set in with terrifying clarity. This was not a battle to escape. This was an ending. Officers moved through smoke-filled corridors, shouting orders that could no longer change the outcome. Wounded sailors were dragged toward ladders that led nowhere safe. Ammunition fires burned with an intensity that could not be smothered. Above deck, the sea glowed with reflected fire. Shells still fell, but the rhythm of Haguro's guns faltered, then broke apart entirely. In the final minutes, the firing from the destroyers slowed. They had learned this lesson well by 1945. There was no need to rush the end. The ship was finished. Haguro rolled further, water pouring through rents in her hull, dragging her down by degrees. Men clung to railings, to each other, to anything that floated. Some jumped, some waited, some simply stood, staring at the night that had swallowed their war. When the cruiser finally capsized and slid beneath the surface, the sea closed over her with startling quiet. No cheers followed, no victory signals, just darkness, broken only by drifting debris and the distant sound of engines pulling away. This had not been a grand fleet engagement. It had not decided the war, but it marked something final. For the last time in World War II, warships had hunted and destroyed each other with guns alone, close, personal, and unforgiving. The sea was suddenly full of voices. Men shouted into the darkness, some in pain, some in panic, some simply calling out names that would never answer. Oil spread across the surface in thick, shimmering sheets, clinging to skin and uniforms, turning every movement into a struggle. Debris floated everywhere, splintered wood, empty life rings, fragments of steel still warm from fire. For the survivors, the war had narrowed to a single task: stay alive until dawn. British destroyers slowed and circled at a distance. Searchlights flicked on briefly, then off again, revealing clusters of men in the water before plunging them back into darkness. The crews watched in silence. They had orders. They also had memories of their own ships lost, their own friends gone beneath the sea. Rescue was not immediate. This was still enemy water. Submarines were still a possibility. Mines were still feared. And above all, the war, though nearly over, was not yet finished. In the water, time stretched and warped. Minutes felt like hours. The burning wreckage that had provided warmth and light drifted away, leaving survivors exposed to cold that crept in slowly, numbing limbs, dulling thoughts. Some men sang, others prayed. Many said nothing at all, conserving breath, staring at the stars that looked exactly the same as they had before the battle began. On the destroyers, officers recorded positions, times, ammunition expenditures. Logs were written carefully, almost clinically. This was habit. This is how navies processed violence, by turning chaos into ink on paper. Only later would the weight of it settle in. As dawn approached, the horizon lightened to a dull gray. The sea revealed what the darkness had hidden. Bodies, rafts, survivors clinging together in small groups, their faces streaked with oil, eyes swollen from smoke and salt. At first light, rescue finally began. Boats were lowered cautiously. Sailors leaned over rails, hauling enemy survivors aboard with the same practiced motions they used for their own. No speeches were exchanged, no apologies offered. Water was passed, blankets wrapped around shaking shoulders. Wounded men we laid out on deck where medics worked quickly and without ceremony. Some survivors asked what had happened to their ship. No one answered. By mid-morning, the sea was quiet again. The last traces of smoke had thinned. The wreck was gone, claimed entirely by the water. Only an empty patch of ocean remained, indistinguishable from any other. For the British crews, there was no sense of triumph. This had not been a glorious victory. It had been precise, efficient, and final. The kind of action that confirmed the war's outcome rather than changing it. For the survivors, the realization came slowly, then all at once. The war they had trained for, the one of fleets, honor, and decisive battle, had ended not with a final charge, but with a sudden ambush in the dark, executed by smaller ships they had been taught not to fear. Word of the engagement traveled quietly through naval channels. There were no headlines, no dramatic announcements. Larger events were unfolding elsewhere. Cities falling, armies surrendering, governments preparing for the end. But among sailors, this battle mattered. It was understood as a closing bracket. After this night, naval warfare would never again look the same. Big ships would no longer meet each other in darkness and trade gunfire at close range. Radar, aircraft, submarines, and missiles had already reshaped the sea into something colder and more distant. This fight belonged to another age, an age where men could still see the enemy ship's silhouette, where gun crews could hear shells passing overhead, where victory came not from distance, but from nerve. The 4 destroyers steamed away, their mission complete, leaving behind a patch of ocean that would never be marked on maps, never visited by memorials, never truly remembered. And yet, in that quiet stretch of water, the last naval gunfight of World War II had come to an end, not with ceremony, but with silence.
The reason this battle happened at all lies not in bravery or desperation, but in inertia. By late July 1945, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Germany had already surrendered, American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands, cities burned nightly under air raids. Fuel shortages crippled what remained of the Imperial Navy. On paper, large-scale naval operations made little sense. Yet ships were still moving. The Japanese cruiser Haguro was not sailing on a grand offensive. It was performing what had become one of the last remaining functions of the Imperial Navy: transport. Carrying troops, supplies, and materiel between isolated garrisons, it was trying to hold together fragments of an empire already collapsing. This was not strategy. It was maintenance of appearances. For the Japanese High Command, abandoning these movements would have been an admission, internally and symbolically, that the Navy no longer mattered. Ships were still sent out because ships had always been sent out. Orders continued because the system that produced them had not yet learned how to stop. On the other side, the British Eastern Fleet was facing its own dilemma. For years, the Royal Navy surface units in the Pacific had played a secondary role to American carrier forces. But now, with Japanese surface ships reduced and air cover weakened, an opportunity existed, one that appealed deeply to naval officers trained in a different era. This was a chance to finish the war the way many of them had imagined it would be fought. The 4 destroyers assigned to intercept Haguro were modern, fast, and equipped with radar systems that transformed night into something readable. Radar did not care about moonlight or clouds. It did not require eyes, only echoes. The Japanese cruiser, by contrast, relied on lookouts, binoculars, and experience. Its crew was well trained, its gunners disciplined, but the tools they depended on belonged to an earlier phase of the war. The imbalance was invisible at first. When the destroyers began tracking Haguro, there was no dramatic maneuvering, no sudden charge, just calculated positioning, angles adjusted by degrees, distances measured in cables, firing solutions refined silently. This was not a duel in the traditional sense. It was a controlled collapse. When the first torpedoes struck, the Japanese crew reacted with professionalism. Damage control teams moved instantly, fires were fought, compartments sealed, counterflooding attempted. The ship did not immediately die, it resisted, as ships are designed to do. But resistance requires time, and time was exactly what the destroyers denied. Each new torpedo hit compounded the previous damage. Speed dropped, steering failed, fires spread beyond containment. The cruiser's massive guns, designed for daylight battles against similar ships, were now largely irrelevant, unable to bring their full power to bear on fast, unseen attackers. Inside the ship, the experience was nightmarish. Corridors filled with smoke so thick men crawled along decks by touch. Power flickered and failed. Orders were shouted, then repeated, then lost entirely. Some compartments flooded silently, trapping men who never knew the full story of what was happening above them. There was no final rally, no last speech, only the growing understanding that the ship was finished. When Haguro finally rolled and slipped beneath the surface, it did so without drama. No massive explosion, no cinematic fireball, just a slow, irreversible tilt, steel yielding to gravity and water. The destroyers did not linger. Their orders were fulfilled, the target was neutralized. Remaining in the area carried unnecessary risk. They withdrew as methodically as they had arrived, leaving the aftermath behind. And in doing so, they closed a chapter of naval warfare that had begun centuries earlier. This battle mattered not because of its scale, but because of its timing. It was a gunfight fought after gunfights had already become obsolete, a surface engagement conducted in a world now ruled by aircraft, submarines, and sensors. The men involved did not know they were participating in the last of anything. They only knew they had done their duty.
By the time the sun rose fully over the Indian Ocean, the sea had already erased most evidence of what had happened. Oil slicks thinned and spread, floating debris drifted apart. The exact position where the cruiser went down became just another set of coordinates in a logbook, important for record-keeping, meaningless to the water itself. For the survivors, memory would do what the ocean would not. Men hauled aboard the British destroyers were exhausted beyond fear. Many had been in the water for hours, clinging to wreckage, fighting cold and oil more than the enemy. When hands finally reached down to pull them up, some wept openly. Others remained rigid and silent, too drained even for relief. They were no longer combatants. They were simply men who had lived. The British crews did not celebrate. A few cigarettes were shared, blankets passed out, someone brewed tea. These small rituals mattered. They restored a sense of normalcy after violence that had been efficient, distant, and strangely impersonal. In the official reports sent up the chain of command, the engagement was described in precise language: times, bearings, torpedo counts, confirmed hits, losses estimated. No adjectives, no emotion. This was standard practice within the Royal Navy. But among the sailors, the meaning of the night was discussed quietly, often much later. Not in terms of victory, but in terms of finality. They understood something instinctively. This was not how future wars at sea would be fought. There would be no more nights like this. No tense waiting for silhouettes, no closing to gun range, no reliance on seamanship and instinct alone. Technology had already shifted the balance. Radar had replaced eyesight. Aircraft had replaced surface fleets. Soon, missiles would replace guns altogether. This battle felt like an echo. For the Japanese survivors, the experience cut even deeper. Many had been trained on the belief that surface combat was the highest expression of naval honor. To be defeated without ever truly seeing the enemy, to be struck from darkness by ships that never came into clear view, was disorienting. Some struggled with shame, others with disbelief, most with grief. News of the loss filtered back slowly. By then, Japan itself was already on the brink of surrender. The destruction of cities, the collapse of supply lines, and the overwhelming force arrayed against the home islands overshadowed any single naval loss. The cruisers' sinking barely registered beyond naval circles. And yet historians would later return to this moment again and again, not because it changed the war, but because it defined an ending. This was the last time surface ships met one another in a traditional gun and torpedo engagement during World War II. After this, naval combat would be dominated entirely by forces that struck from beyond the horizon. What made the moment haunting was how unceremonious it was. No announcement marked it as the final chapter. No one paused to recognize its significance. The men involved went on with their duties, unaware they had just closed a tradition that stretched back to Trafalgar and beyond. War rarely tells you when something is ending. It simply moves on. Decades later, veterans would describe the night in fragments. The sudden shock of explosions, the way the sea glowed briefly with fire, the silence afterward, the feeling that something old had slipped away beneath the waves along with the ship. For them, it was not a historical milestone. It was just the night they survived. And that is why this battle matters. Not for its scale, not for its strategy, but because it reminds us that history does not end with speeches or ceremonies. Sometimes it ends quietly in darkness, with a few ships turning away and an empty sea closing over what will never return. The war ended not long after that night. Official documents were signed, flags were lowered, radios carried the news across oceans and continents. For most of the world, the end of World War II is remembered through those moments, ceremonial, unmistakable, final. But history is rarely defined only by what is announced. Sometimes it ends in places where no one is watching. Far from capitals and surrender decks, 4 destroyers turned away from a dark stretch of ocean, their engines steady, their crews silent. Behind them, the sea closed over wreckage and memory alike. Ahead of them lay a future where wars would be fought from farther away, with less warning and less room for human judgment. What happened that night did not change the outcome of the war. It revealed something deeper. It showed how entire systems continue moving even after their purpose is gone. How ships still sail, orders still flow, and men still fight, not because victory is possible, but because stopping is harder than continuing. For the sailors on both sides, there was no sense of legacy in the moment, only fatigue, only survival, only the knowledge that friends were gone and the sea would never give them back. And yet, with distance, meaning emerges. This was the final echo of an age when navies met face to face in darkness, when the outcome depended on nerve, training, and the ability to fight while seeing the enemy. An age that began with broadsides and ended with radar screens. After this, the ocean would never again belong to ships alone. If you're still here, take a moment to reflect on how quietly history can turn a page. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story stayed with you the most? And if you want more deep documentary-style stories about the moments that ended eras, often without anyone realizing it, subscribe to the channel and watch the next video on your screen. Because the most important endings in history are rarely announced. They simply happen.